Okay, so today we're just going to be breaking down what each speech in a parliamentary debate should accomplish. So, what we've got are these six parliamentary debate speeches. So, we have the Gov marked in pink and the Op marked in blue. So, we have the Prime Minister constructive, which is 7 minutes, the Leader of Opposition constructive, which is 8 minutes, the Member of Government constructive, which is 8 minutes, the Member of Opposition constructive, which is 8 minutes, the Leader of Opposition rebuttal speech, which is 4 minutes, and the Prime Minister rebuttal speech, which is in 5 minutes. So, just some things to note. The prime minister and the leader both speak twice. So, we have one constructive speech and one rebuttal speech apiece. However, the members only speak once. Another thing to consider is this block area. So, we have the 12 minutes of uninterrupted speaking time where the op goes twice in a row. However, some people consider the gov actually at an advantage despite this 12 minutes of uninterrupted speaking time because they get the first and the last word in the debate. So, just some things to keep in mind. Now, just looking at constructive and rebuttal speeches, in constructive speeches, new arguments are allowed. However, in rebuttal speeches, new arguments are not allowed. So, let's look at this a little bit further. So, here are the four constructive speeches, and here are the rebuttal speeches. Note the C for constructive and the R for rebuttal. So, a key thing to remember is that new supporting evidence is allowed, however, new points, attacks, or arguments are not allowed in the rebuttal speeches. Let's give an example. Say I was trying to convince someone to reduce overcrowding in prisons, and one of the arguments I brought up was that overcrowding prisons cause recidivism. Okay, I don't know if that's true or not, but let's just use it as an example. In my rebuttal speech, it would be okay for me to bring up a statistic that wasn't previously introduced that was like 80% of recidivists come from overcrowded prisons. That's all right because it's not an argument. I'm just further supporting an argument that already existed. So this is just new supporting evidence, not actually a new point. However, I could not bring up an argument in the rebuttal speech that was like, we should reduce overcrowding because overcrowding is bad for COVID 19. I couldn't say that because I didn't say it previously and it's a new point or argument. So that would not be allowed in a rebuttal speech. So here's the difference between a constructive and rebuttal speech and what's allowed in a rebuttal speech in particular. Now let's take a look at the first speech in the round given by the Gov by the Prime Minister Constructive, or the PMC. So the PMC's job is to introduce the on case. Now what the on case means is the Gov team's case. Now, sometimes this is a bit confusing because a team thinks that the on case means just their own case, but that's not true. The on case just literally means the government team's case. It doesn't matter if you're gov or op, you're always going to refer to the gov case as the on case. So the PMC should do the job of introducing the government team's arguments, so it introduces the on case. So here are some components of the on case. We have the top of case and the contentions. They should be reviewed from the fact value presentation. So on the on case, we have our top of case with all of its elements and the contentions which should be structured in Tolman's model. Now, the top of case shouldn't be super important in the debate. I mean, the weighting mechanism and value is important, but it shouldn't be contested. Rather, the contentions are the meat of the argumentation and should be where the most clash happens between the two sides. So, the PMC's job is to really flesh out those contentions and explain why these arguments make sense and why they are reason to vote for the government team. Let's look at our hypothetical flow. A flow is just a written record of what is said in a debate, and it's good for each debater to write down a flow so that they can keep track of what their opponents and what they have said. So let's look at what's now on the flow. On the on case, we have the top of case and the contentions that were brought up by the Prime Minister Constructive. Note that the on case is the only thing in existence right now because the Prime Minister Constructive has just happened, which means there is no opportunity to respond at all by the op, and these are just the only things that exist. So here we have our contentions in Toulmin's model, and they have two in this case. Two is a good number because, in terms of contentions, 2 to 3, just as a reminder, is the sweet spot. So all gov constructive arguments come out in the first speech. That means that any points, any contentions should appear in the Prime Minister constructive. So the Prime Minister really sets the tone for the entire debate, and all arguments that are going to be introduced that are in contention form should come out then. Now, you're not going to be engaging in any rebuttals or refutations because right now the on case is the only thing on the flow. So it doesn't make sense to have to attack anything yet because right now the only side that's spoken is the gov. Next, let's address the Leader of Opposition Constructive, or the LOC. So the first speech made by the op. The LOC does two things. It should introduce the off case and attack the on case. Now, the off case just means the opposition team's case. Just like on case refers to the gov case, off case refers to the op case. So it doesn't matter if you're gov or op. When you want to talk about the opposition's case, you're just going to call it the off case. So they're attacking the gov, introducing the op case. So now let's examine the actual elements of the Leader of Opposition constructive speech. So when they hop onto the off case or the op case, they should be introducing these counter contentions, which, if you'll remember, are essentially like contentions but for the op and argue against the resolution. Now, then they should jump onto the on case and explain why the gov contentions are specifically wrong. So they should be rebuttaling these contentions. Let's look at our flow. So we have this newly minted off case where the opposition team introduces these counter contentions that are completely new. Then they hop onto the on case and they start attacking the contention. So here they've introduced attacks to counter contention, to contention 1 and to contention 2. So as we can see, we introduced counter contentions, attacked contentions, and that is the main job of the Leader of Opposition constructive. So the LFC should touch every argument that appears on the flow. So their job is to say, here's our new counter contentions, let's address everything the government team has said so far. Something to note is that the off case and rebuttals to the gov case are different. What that means is that, so if we look at our hypothetical flow, there's a difference between having these counter contentions and having these rebuttals. So counter contentions are like a unique reason to vote op because they're like arguments against the resolution itself. However, these rebuttals are attacks specifically against the contentions, so explaining why the government team is specifically wrong and uses incorrect contentions. So there's a difference between these two, and to keep a really neat debate, what you want to do is have your off case separate from just these rebuttals that exist on the on case. So let's look at the member speeches, the member of government constructive and the member of opposition constructive. So the goal of both member speeches is to rebuild your own team's case and attack your opponent's case. So it doesn't matter what side you want because the member speeches have roughly the same objective. Both of their jobs is to rebuild your own case and to attack the opposite case. Let's take a look. So, with the member of government constructive speech, the job is to rebuttal the off case. So, they should be introducing new attacks on the counter contentions that were previously brought up by the Leader of Opposition. Then, after that, they should rebuild or refute attacks that exist onto the on case. So, they should be addressing the attacks that the Leader of Opposition made on their own on case or their own contentions and rebuild those contentions. Meanwhile, the member of op is going to do exactly the opposite thing. What they're first going to do is rebuttal the on case, so explain yet again, why those contentions are wrong, then rebuild and refute the attacks that were made onto their counter contentions, so undoing what the member of government just did and strengthening their own counter contentions. So it's like these two flip flopped. We have, uh, we have rebuttal the counter contentions and protect the contentions, and here we have rebuttal the contentions and protect the counter contentions. So honestly, they have the same goal, but just flip-flopped. So let's look what now it's on our flow. So let's pretend that this greenish seafoam color is the member of government team. So what they're going to do is introduce some new attacks onto the off case. So attack these counter contentions. Then they're going to hop over and refute the attacks that the Leader of Opposition made on these contentions and rebuild them. So making these contentions strong and strengthening the claim, data, and the warrant in all of them. Then just imagine that this yellow color is our member of op. The member of op is going to do the opposite. It's going to, for instance, refute the attacks previously made on the counter contentions and rebuild and strengthen them. Then is going to hop onto the contentions and explain further why these contentions are incorrect. by hammering home the points already brought up in the Leader of Opposition's speech, as well as introducing some new ideas why these contentions may be false. So, as we can see, the whole point of the member speeches is to introduce this crossfire, where they're attacking the contentions and counter contentions and using specific refutations to specific parts of each argument and case. Member speeches, especially the member of government constructive, should touch everything. Now, the reason why is because there's a little saying in debate that goes that silence is compliance. Now, what that just means is that if your opponents fail to touch something, they agree with the argument and they yield it to you, and you win that argument. This applies whether you're on the government or the opposition. However, a big issue with the member of government is that they must touch everything, otherwise, their partner, the prime minister, will not be able to touch the arguments that previously went untouched by the member of gov in their last speech. The reason being that new rebuttals cannot be introduced in the rebuttal speeches, only a reiteration of what was previously said. Therefore, the member has to be careful to touch everything, the member of gov, because they want to make sure that their partner can emphasize further and explain the attacks further instead of just getting stuck with not being able to say anything about it at all. So, let's look at our rebuttal speeches with that in mind, our Leader of Opposition rebuttal and our Prime Minister rebuttal. So, rebuttal speeches just sum up the arguments. They tell the judge how to vote based on the weighing mechanism or the value. Now, this is a really key idea right here. The important thing to remember is that no new arguments or specific refutation is or even specific refutation is brought up in rebuttal speeches because their job is to explain to the judge where they're winning and how to vote based on that information. For instance, my contention 1 is more important than their counter contention 2, or my counter contention 1 trumps both their contention 1 and contention 2. Something like that. And the reason why you want to be careful to make these arguments and explain it to the judge is because you don't want it to leave it up to them in their own discretion to decide what is important. You don't know if they've had their coffee that day or something, but you want to make sure that they know what the important arguments are so that they don't end up voting on random points that weren't actually very important. So don't leave anything up to chance. Make sure your judge understands what's important in the round. So let's look at our two rebuttal speeches. We have our Leader of Opposition rebuttal speech and the Prime Minister rebuttal speech. So, for the Leader of Opposition, there are two main jobs in this speech. They should point out where they're winning and connect everything back to the weighing mechanism or value. This is a really key idea here. So, say I have just two arguments, like uh, I have an argument about climate change, and then my opponents have an argument about the economy. The judge doesn't know what to do with that. However, if I'm like on the value of utilitarianism, it makes the most sense to value this argument about climate change because climate change will affect way more people than the economy. That way, you explain to your judge based on the value or the weighing mechanism set previously in the round, it makes the most sense to vote for your side. So, this is a really key thing to do, as well as pointing out where you're winning to emphasize the strength of your own case and the weakness of your opponents. Now, the PMR should do the same thing. In fact, those are really important. They should point out where you're winning and connect back to a weighing mechanism or value. For instance, our contention 1 and contention 2 clearly win on the weighing mechanism of preponderance of evidence based on quality and quantity because we have the most reasoning, we also have the most logic, and our contentions are much stronger than their counter contentions, for example. However, they may need to conduct specific refutation as well on particular arguments. Now, the reason why this is true is because oftentimes the block has given an opportunity to have 12 minutes to just hammer home their own case and attack the government team's case. So they might have to just quickly bring back their contentions, clean up the flow, and ensure that they still have a case standing in order to do this weighing. Because, again, the opposite just had 12 minutes to hammer in their case, so they might have to do some specific rebuttaling and refutation on the case itself. So let's look at our flow. Let's imagine this white is the Leader of Opposition rebuttal speaker. So, they should maybe hop onto the on case and summarize why they have taken out these contentions. So, just a quick restatement, maybe of these refutation of these attacks, and an explanation of why these contentions don't apply. Then they should hop onto the off case, their own case, and explain why they have defended their counter contention. So, restating these rebuilds, these refutations, and explaining why these counter contentions are significant. Finally, they should use the weighing mechanism and value and explain why they have won. So say something like, even if you don't buy the fact that we have clearly taken out our contentions and clearly rebuilt our contentions, remember that our counter contentions adhere more to the weighing mechanism of preponderance of evidence based on quality and quantity because of XYZ. Now, let's picture that this purple text is our prime minister rebuttal. So, first, they might want to hop onto the off case and summarize why the government team has taken out these counter contentions. So, just restate these attacks and explain why they don't apply. Then jump onto the on case and explain why why their contentions are still standing. Now, it's important to remember that they may have to do some defense of these contentions because of the block, so they might just engage in some specific refutation. However, they after that they should summarize why these contentions are important and why they have won them. Finally, using the weighing mechanism value, again, it's very important to explain why you have won given the arguments and their connection to the weighing mechanism or value. So, this is very important. All right, so this should be our entire flow. In fact, after a debate, it should look something like this. You have the constructive on case and the constructive off case, where you have these contentions and counter contentions, then specific attacks, rebuttals, refutations, and rebuilds on each one, then a summary of the most important points in the debate and how it connects to the weighing mechanism and value. It's really key not to get too hung up into individual arguments and tell the judge why you won overall. You want to have a broad view of the entire debate because if we just spent the entire rebuttal speeches just adding more attacks and refuting the attacks, then it'd just be confusing and the judge wouldn't know what to do. They might just vote on the argument that they feel like instead of the most important arguments. So it's important to tell your judge what's important and to narrow your focus to what will actually matter in terms of the weighing mechanism and the value. So now we're just going to quickly go over roadmaps, which are a typically off-time statement describing the order of your speech. So before the time starts, you're going to state your roadmap. So here's an example of a roadmap, which is I will be going off case, then on case, or I'm going to be going on the op case, then the gov case. So this just tells the judge what you're going to do in your round. It makes it easy to follow, but should not be used at all for argumentation. Now the reason why is it's because it's typically off time, so it doesn't make any sense to be making arguments in a roadmap. Now, a note is that every speech has a roadmap except the PMC, which wouldn't make any sense. Because you really couldn't say, I will be going off case in the PMC because there is no op case yet. You're the first speaker, so you just introduced the gov. So you would just say, I will be going on case, and that's obvious. So no need for a roadmap on the last one. However, the three constructive speeches, besides that, the leader of opposition constructive and the two member speeches, should have a roadmap that looks something like this. I will be going off case, then on case. The rebuttal speeches shouldn't have a roadmap that looks like this. And the reason why is because the three constructive speeches should be going down the flow. So they should just go down the list of counter contentions, then down the list of contentions, and just rebuttal specific points. The rebuttal speeches don't do that. They look holistically at the entire debate and they just summarize the most important points of the round. So their roadmap would probably sound like this. I'm just going to be addressing the most important points of the round, and then I will be doing some weighing for you based on the weighing mechanism / value. So, a roadmap is going to be looking different for the rebuttal speeches, but here's how it'll look for the three constructive speeches besides the PMC. All right, thank you for listening, and I hope you learned about the breakdown of speeches in parliamentary debate.